All right, folks, it is February and we got a doozy for you. So, the DoD Inspector General has released their report of their audit of the DoD's process for authorizing C3PAOs to perform CMMC assessments. It's a large report. There's a lot of details that are not immediately apparent if you only read the first page of the report, the press release, or any of the quote unquote headlines covering the report. So we are going to split our analysis and summary of the report into 4 different episodes to keep things nice, condensed, and bite-sized for everybody. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I think it's always nice that when we break it down and we get more detailed into individual parts of it. I also think that it's nice that we start this right around Groundhog Day, right, Jacob? Punxsutawney Phil comes out, and if he's still even called that, and he sees his shadow, and there's 6 more weeks of winter. An IG report comes out, and somebody reads the first page of it, and now they think everything is falling until you get to the end of it, and you realize they're not. So what we're going to do over the next couple of weeks is make sure that people understand exactly what's in the pages of that report.
Yeah, absolutely. We've made a lot of episodes over a lot of DoD IG reports over the years, and this one is no different. We're going to walk through it just like we always do. We're going to talk about the findings. I am not going to editorialize or add my opinion on what the findings say until we get to the very last episode. I've got a lot of strong opinions about how people have read or not read the report and how they have decided to interpret it. But what we're going to do is chop this up so that it's much easier to digest, and then you can decide what you think the report says all on your own, and then we'll add what we think at the end. How about that?
That's a bold strategy, Cotton.
Yeah. Okay, so DoD contractors, to cover the basics here. So DoD contractors that maintain controlled unclassified information that is critical to national security, as they say, must undergo CMMC Level 2 assessments performed by authorized CMMC third-party assessment organizations known as C3PAOs. In November of 2020, the DoD issued what's known as a no-cost contract to the CMMC accreditation body, the Cyber AB, as it's now called, to manage the C3PAO authorization process and ensure that the candidate C3PAOs meet all of their requirements to conduct these assessments. Candidate C3PAOs have to successfully complete a series of 12 requirements before they can be authorized to perform CMMC Level 2 assessments, and the DoD Inspector General sought to determine whether DoD ensured that the process for authorizing C3PAOs to conduct CMMC 2.0 Level 2 assessments was effectively implemented by the DoD. In order to do this, the IG reviewed the application packages of 11 of the 48 C3PAOs that the Cyber AB had authorized to perform CMMC Level 2 assessments as of September of 2023. This is very important to understand that although this report is coming out in January of 2025, it documents their findings from a long time ago. And the most important thing to remember is that's before the final rule was published. So all of this was still in this interim liminal space before we had the final rule. That will be important later. The other thing that they did was they observed 3 of the CMMC Level 2 assessments that were conducted by DIBCAC. For companies to become C3PAOs, they have to have a CMMC Level 2 assessment conducted by DoD's auditing team known as DIBCAC. Overall, the IG made 10 recommendations, and today in this episode, part 1 of 4, if you can believe it, we're going to talk about what they recommended specifically for the DoD Chief Information Officer and the CMMC Program Management Office. That's Stacy Boschanic for everybody else, the DoD CIO / CMMC PMO. We're going to cover the rest of the recommendations in upcoming episodes, but to keep these things relatively short, we're just going to chop them up because it's already a long report. People aren't reading it to the end, so at least we can try to get people to listen to the end of a shortish episode.
All right. So just to recap that, you're saying contract was put in place between the PMO's office and the AB to carry out this ecosystem to certify this, and they had to put a process in place. The AB did. put a process in place to make sure that the ecosystem is populated, especially the assessors. And now this Inspector General report is just making sure that that process is not only operating according to the plan, but identifying areas for maybe better efficiency or more clarity and stuff like that. So you're basically standard run-of-the-mill check of quality, right?
Standard audit. Your number gets pulled and the IG shows up to give you an audit, and that's the way that it runs. This wasn't done out of some sort of suspicion of malfeasance. It's not an investigation. It's just a DoD IG audit. And so, that was the basis.
The timeline. So you can't, if this was a movie, like you couldn't write the timeline.
It is. Whoa. I already said, I promised at the beginning, I'm not going to editorialize whether the IG was correct to
I tried to bait you. I'm sorry,
process before it was finalized. I'm not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about what's in the report. You almost got me. People are going to have to wait until episode 4, and then I'll add what I think. But this is about what the people think. So what the people think. Okay, so let's talk about this authorization process, because this is what the IG was looking at. So 3 different organizations have responsibilities associated with the C3PAO authorization process, which is what the IG was looking at. Those 3 organizations are the Cyber Accreditation Body, the Cyber AB, the CMMC Program Management Office, the CMMC PMO, that's Stacy Bostjanek, and the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, or DIBCAC. That's a fun trivia for hanging out at the bar with your friends, is what DIBCAC actually stands for. A lot of people don't know.
It's it always is a tongue twister. Like you're like, I know it. I'm going to be embarrassed if I don't know it. And then usually drop the ball.
So there's 12 steps divided across these 3 organizations. The Cyber AB is responsible for 10 of them. So the Cyber AB is responsible for overseeing the submission of C3PO application fees, the payment of the application fees, passing organizational background checks performed by the Cyber AB, passing foreign ownership control or influence reviews, participating in interviews with the AB to outline the C3PAO's business operations and readiness for their own CMMC Level 2 assessment, making sure that there are signed C3PAO agreements and codes of professional conduct, the payment of activation fees, providing verification of insurance, implementing assessment appeals processes that are approved by the Cyber AB, and employing or awarding contracts to CMMC certified assessors and certified quality control lead personnel within the organization. The other 2 steps are the responsibility of the other 2 entities. So the CMMC PMO, in addition to being responsible for overall CMMC policy, assessment guide development, all that other stuff, as far as the authorization process is concerned, they are responsible for performing a separate organizational background check to assess the candidate C3PAO's operational risks. It's not easy to become a C3PAO, everybody. And then finally, DIBCAC, the 12th and final step, they're the ones that actually conduct the CMMC Level 2 assessment of candidate C3PAOs, as the DoD requires that the candidate C3PAOs undergo the same assessment that they will be responsible for performing once they are authorized. Those are the 12 steps in the C3PAO authorization process. Those are the 12 steps that the IG wanted to see. Is the DoD effectively implementing that process? And that's what this report is summarizing. So the IG, the Inspector General, identified deficiencies concerning the successful completion of 3 of the 12 requirements, and they say that supports the need for an overall quality assurance process. They found issues with maintaining signed documentation around C3PO agreements and codes of professional conduct. They found issues around employing or awarding contracts to CMMC certified assessors or quality leads. And they found issues with DIBCAC's interpretation of cybersecurity controls during those assessments. The IG made 10 recommendations. How I categorize these things and how these episodes will be divided is like so. 3 of those recommendations are mostly related to the DoD CIO, the CMMC PMO. 5 of those recommendations are related to the Cyber AB, and 2 of those recommendations are related to DIBCAC. So we're going to divide it into that. Today, we're just talking about the findings related to CIO, CMMC PMO. We're going to cover the AB and DIBCAC and beyond in future episodes.
So I just want to just to double check. Yeah. So the way that it's split up is that you took the findings and you grouped them based on the 12-step process where that finding falls into the responsibility tree of that process.
Yeah, so they had multiple findings, but they make 10 recommendations. And this is one of the tricky parts about IG reports is that they list off all the findings in the report as if they're completely authoritative and 100% clear cut. And then later on in the report, they go, well, this is what we recommended, and this is what we decided the solution was going to be after talking with people from the finding. So what
Okay.
we're going to do here is we're going to talk about their recommendation in the context of the finding rather than keeping them separate like they do in IG reports, because that leads people to believe that these are all burning trash fires that need to be put out immediately, and the whole process is completely out of control. Even that summary that I just gave that said, oh, there's issues around these three things, makes them seem like they're really bad. And as we'll find out, when you dig into the details, a lot of these findings aren't even findings anymore, right?
Sure.
So let's talk about this. So what does this finding status, recommendation status mean? This all sounds really, really bad. So essentially, recommendations in IG reports can have one of three statuses. So 5 of these 10 recommendations are unresolved, is what they say, which according to the IG means that management, the DoD PMO, DoD CIO, management has not agreed to implement the recommendation or has not proposed actions that will address the recommendation. So half of the recommendations are currently unresolved. 4 of the recommendations are resolved, which means that management has agreed to implement the recommendation or has approved or has proposed actions that will address the underlying finding. One of the recommendations is what is known as closed, that the OIG has verified and agreed upon corrective actions and implemented, and it's gone forever. So half of these recommendations are done, half of the recommendations are unresolved. So we're going to walk through all of them, and you can decide, should they be resolved? Is there anything actually to resolve? Did they resolve these things correctly? What do you think?
And then I have a fourth question. What happens if they're unresolved? If they remain unresolved, right? Because it's a recommendation. I recommend that you don't jump on the bed, but you can still jump
Yeah.
on the bed and fall and hurt your head, right?
Correct. Yeah, and it can be a back and forth for a long time, right? It can be a back and forth for a long time. So let's walk through the recommendations here and their statuses, and then people can decide. Let us know in the comments. Do you think that this is an issue? Do you think that this is unresolved? Do you think that it is resolved? We'll figure it out from there as we walk through it. Okay. So, like I said, today we're just talking about the 3 recommendations related to the DoD CIO and CMMC PMO. So the Inspector General found, here's how they summarize the finding, that the DoD CIO did not have a quality assurance process in place for verifying that the C3PAO authorization process, those 12 steps, was effectively implemented before candidate C3PAOs are authorized to perform CMMC level 2 assessments. Geez, that sounds really bad. So as a result of that finding, they make 3 recommendations. So the first is that the DoD CIO should develop and implement a quality assurance process that will ensure that all requirements in the CMMC 3PAO authorization process, those 12 steps, are successfully met before a candidate C3PAO is authorized to perform CMMC level 2 assessments. Currently, as of this conversation, that recommendation is what is known as unresolved. We'll talk about those details in a minute. Here's the other 2 recommendations that they made. The CMMC PMO director, Stacy Bosch-Janik, should develop and implement a formal reauthorization process for C3PAOs that includes a review and verification for all requirements in the C3PAO authorization process. That is resolved. That is not an open finding or recommendation. That's done. We've been talking about this. They've been talking about it on the town hall. Currently, C3PAOs are going through reauthorization right now. All of the current valid C3PAOs have been reauthorized, right? So this report is at a window in time prior to the current conversation that we're having. And then lastly, the CMMC PMO should develop and implement a process to ensure C3PAOs immediately notify both the CMMC PMO and Cyber AB of any changes associated with any of the requirements in the C3PAO authorization process, those 12 steps, That is also resolved, and I'm not going to add any comments about the IG making recommendations for things that were already in the process that maybe they just missed. We're not going to editorialize. We're going to save that for the last episode.
Yeah, well, we're not editorializing. Yes, you would think that the number one on this list, the go through and the quality assurance process for the entire thing is pretty important. Needs to be of the utmost priority. But realistically, like, it's kind of already happening. But that's, again, editorializing. That's my opinion. We'll go from there.
So let's go into each of these recommendations and their statuses one by one. So let's start with the unresolved one, because this is the one that got everybody's attention. So the DoD CIO should develop and implement a quality assurance process that will ensure all requirements in the 12-step authorization process are successfully met before a candidate C3PAO is authorized to perform CMMC Level 2 assessments. Sounds pretty reasonable. This recommendation is currently unresolved because, why is it unresolved? Currently unresolved because, according to the IG, the DoD CIO only partially addressed the recommendation. This is the part that's buried in the report, because when you read the first page, it makes it sound like, oh my God, they have no quality assurance whatsoever. Well,
They're not checking anything.
Oh my God, it's unresolved. They haven't done anything. Well, actually, according to the IG, it's only because part of the problem maybe still exists, not because the entire thing is just completely out of control. Okay. So according to the CMMC PMO, in response to the IG findings, the DoD CIO's office does not plan to develop a quality assurance process because the CMMC program was designed to rely on an ISO standard that for compliant accreditation bodies to oversee the CMMC ecosystem as established in the CMMC final rule. The CMMC PMO considers ISO 17011 accreditation standards sufficient to ensure that the Cyber AB is effectively implementing the 12-step C3PAO authorization process, at least the portions of those steps that they're responsible for. Okay. The DoD CIO plans to rely solely on the DoD's requirement that the Cyber AB comply with ISO 17011 standards as assurance that the C3PAO authorization process is effectively implemented. The ISO accreditation standard focuses on competency, operation consistency, and impartiality of accreditation bodies. In this case, the Cyber AB is the accreditation body. For an organization to meet this ISO standard, it has to, among a bunch of other things, develop policies and procedures for accrediting assessment organizations, such as C3PAOs in this example, and it must implement a process to evaluate and monitor personnel involved in the accreditation process. The DoD's contract with the Cyber AB requires that the AB comply with this ISO standard within 24 months of the effective date of CMMC 2.0, which was December 16th of 2024. So there's a window of time where they have to get this ISO standard, because, as Matt Travis has told us on the town hall, you can't get certified against a program that doesn't exist. And until the program exists in the final rule, you can't go get the ISO evaluative standard. So that's what the DoD CIO CMMC PMO says. The IG said you need an overall quality process for this overall authorization process, these 12 steps. And the PMO says, well, we're relying on this requirement. The AB uses the international standard for accrediting bodies for the steps in the authorization process. But remember, it's unresolved because they only partially addressed the recommendation. So what does the IG say in response, right? The IG in response says, we acknowledge that ISO 17011 accreditation standards complement the Cyber AB's process to authorize C3PAOs, but it does not ensure that the Cyber AB, the PMO, and DIBCAC, all three organizations in charge of all 12 steps rather than just the AB and their 10 steps, that all three organizations have implemented the overall process. The IG goes on to say that the Cyber AB is not the only organization that has responsibilities associated with the C3PAO authorization process, and that two key steps in the authorization process, being the CMMC PMO and their responsibilities for conducting background investigations, and DIBCAC's responsibility for conducting CMMC Level 2 assessments of the C3PAOs. So they say this is only partially satisfied because you responded to this issue and said we're relying on ISO 1711, and that's for the AB's portion of the steps. Now, one thing you might be asking yourself is, all right, well, if we need an overall quality process for all 12 steps, were there issues in the other steps outside of the 10 that the AB is responsible for? And the answer is no. The IG did not find issues with the CMMC PMO conducting their step over background investigations. And where, as we'll talk about in a future episode, the IG found issues with DIBCAC's evaluation of certain controls, DIBCAC already has their own quality assurance process that they're beefing up in response to IG recommendations. So what do you think? Do you think that the CMMC PMO's answer is correct? Do you think that the CMMC PMO and the DoD CIO need an additional process on top of these 12 steps, on top of DIBCAC's quality process, on top of the thing that the PMO is already responsible for, which the IG found no issues with, on top of the ISO standard for the cyber AB and the 10 steps that they're responsible for, most of which the IG found no issues or only minor issues with? That's essentially the impasse at this point. Is the IG thinks that there needs to be another process on top of those. The PMO says that they disagree.
So the initial response from the PMO's office was the retort that this is covered, and they're like, no, it needs to be covered for everybody, you know, like, and they were just isolating into whatever the
IG says
role was.
it covers 10 of the 12 steps. It doesn't cover all 12 steps, and we think that there ought to be one for all 12. So there's a little bit more information.
Because it's an audit of the DoD's process, not an audit of the cyber AB's process.
Right. Now, is this like a back-breaking finding because there were findings everywhere and constant issues? That's not what the report says. But they go on here, and there's a little bit more back and forth between the two organizations here. So the DoD CIO also stated that the CMMC Program Management Office maintains regular and recurring communications with the cyber AB to discuss contract performance, including the progress of candidate C3PAOs through this 12-step authorization process, and that the Office of the DoD CIO conducts contractual oversight of the contract with the cyber AB. So not only do we have this ISO standard for the AB, but we also have oversight of our relationship with the AB. Everything is fine. The IG, however, says that although that's what you claim, that you conduct contractual oversight of this contract with the AB, they were unable to verify whether the oversight was being conducted. Not good. And that the contract between the DoD and the AB says that the DoD CIO will hold meetings with the AB, be provided authorization records and status from the AB, be provided results of all ISO 17011 peer review processes. But according to the CMMC PMO, they don't review the authorization records for accuracy and completeness. Also not great. And then they go on to say, furthermore, the cyber AB is not required to comply with ISO 17011 accreditation standards until 24 months from the effective date of the rule, which is December 2026 at the earliest, according to the AB. So there's some gaps here. So as a result, it's only partially addressed. So what do you guys think? Let us know in the comments. Let us know in chat. Do you think that this is a massive unresolved issue? Do you think that there needs to be an additional oversight process over all 12 steps on top of DIBCAC's quality process, on top of the PMO's process that has no issues, and on top of the AB's 10-step process, things on top of the contract between these two organizations? How big of an issue do you think this is? How unresolved do you think the issue is? Because currently the PMO and the IG do not agree.
Yeah, it's just the thing of we want verification of every single entity that's involved in this, that the process is being carried out. And then I kind of, again, I have to steer away. But there is that gap, that 2-year gap, right? Where, you know, you saying that you're relying on ISO cert, right? To say that the AB is doing what they're supposed to be doing as a accreditation body, but they're not required to adhere to that or to get that until 2 years from now. So in that time period between now and 2 years from now, what is assuring that they're operating within that standard, right?
And this is the part that annoys me about the PMO's office, where I'm like, if you know that there's this 2-year gap, right, and you are relying on your contractual oversight with the AB and their certification under ISO, as a stand-in for an overall quality process. You cannot expect the IG to come into your office and then have you be like, well, we can't prove that we're conducting any oversight, and then expect them to not recommend an oversight process. You have to be on your P's and Q's, just like a DoD contractor has to prove through their paperwork that they're actually doing the processes that they claim to do. You also have to be able to do those processes. Now, the caveat here is that all of this was done before the rule was final. So there's a little bit of wiggle room, but honestly, you got to be better about the paperwork than this. Like, you got to be able to prove that you're conducting this oversight. You're clearly having the meetings. You're clearly talking to them as processes are going on. I don't know if they shelled up because rulemaking was ongoing and things were kind of on hold with what they were communicating. I don't know, but they need to be better. And so the finding is helpful because they're like, listen, if you don't tighten up the processes that you're relying on, then we're going to recommend that you have a huge additional process, which probably doesn't solve the problem if you just actually do the things that you said that you were going to do, right?
Yeah, that's the key word. It is a helpful finding. It's not a hurtful finding.
That's a good way to put it. So that's the open, unresolved, if you will, finding, because it's only partially met, and they're currently debating about what the solution is. I think that tightening up the current oversight mechanisms is probably sufficient. The IG thinks that there needs to be an additional oversight mechanism on top. What do you guys think? What do you think the solution should be here? Okay, so that's the one that's unresolved. Let's talk about the other two findings that are resolved. So the second recommendations, I keep using those interchangeably. The other two recommendations that are resolved. So the second recommendation was that the CMMC PMO director, Stacy, should develop and implement a formal reauthorization process for C3PAOs that includes a review and verification for all requirements in the C3PAO authorization process. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's what's happening. And so as a result, the recommendation is resolved because, as the DoD CIO, according to the DoD IG, the CIO addressed all specifics of this recommendation. So this is not an open finding. It's not an open recommendation. It's green. It's done. It doesn't say that in the first page or the summary or the press release or the news reports or the headlines about this report. It doesn't tell you that. You got to read the whole thing. So the DoD CIO said two things: that they initiated a C3PAO authorization and reauthorization process, and they are the same. It's the same 12 steps that companies have to go through to be reauthorized as a C3PAO now that the rule is final, that they had to go through before the rule was final. It's nothing different. And that the CMMC PMO director will pursue the addition of new contract deliverables that will outline the Cyber AB's internal processes for tracking and managing the authorization and reauthorization of C3PAOs. Sounds great. Sounds great. That's what they're doing. That's what they will do. That meets the recommendation of the IG. Therefore, it is resolved. They met all points of the recommendation. It's green on the dashboard. It's over with. But
This
it's still
is
at the
one
front
for
of the
sure.
report. So if you only read the first page, you can be like, oh my God, they don't have a reauthorization process. It's not
Yeah,
true.
so this is one that we knew, or that they knew existed, prior to the report being published, right?
Yeah.
Because it was part of that checklist process that they were adamant about completing before the rule became final.
Exactly.
So it demonstrated improvement, right?
Yeah. So, not to cast judgment on anybody, but if you were on social media and you saw companies being like, we are now reauthorized as a C3PAO, and then a couple weeks later, the IG report comes out and you start yelling about how there's no reauthorization process, maybe you're the problem. Maybe you're the problem. Okay. Let's get to the last recommendation here.
Had to sneak it in.
Had to sneak that. I'm not judging. I'm not adding my opinion. I'm just saying, hypothetically, it might be you.
I mean, but that's been the constant theme here, right? Like not to steer away from the thing, but that has been the constant theme. For some reason, we constantly get to this point where we're like head above water and we're making progress and people are starting to see, understand what's going on. And then we get this blast from the past, right? And the blast from the past comes up and they're like, oh my God, this is official. This just happened today. No, it's just the way the government works, and it took a year and a half for us to see it.
Well, spoiler alert, everybody. Everybody really focused on this IG report. I mean, really honed in on this IG report and really took the recommendations and findings in this report as gospel without reading into the details. And so in the future, I think we might revisit some of the IG reports that, I don't know, consistently showed year after year that defense contractors weren't implementing cybersecurity requirements that nobody makes a big deal out of. Nobody brings those up. Nobody puts those on the same level. You know what? I'm not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about that in a different episode. Let's talk about the last finding here. Let's talk about the last finding. Okay, so the third and final finding related to the CIO PMO. The CMMC PMO, Stacy, should develop and implement a process to ensure C3PAOs immediately notify both the CMMC PMO and Cyber AB of any changes associated with any of the requirements in the 12-step C3PAO authorization process. Geez, that sounds pretty routine. That sounds like something that you would hope was already in existence inside of the way that the PMO and the AB and the C3POs operate. It would be stunning if that didn't exist. And as it turns out, it does exist. The DoD IG decided to make a recommendation for a thing that was already in place, but it doesn't say that on the first page. So this recommendation is resolved. It is not an open recommendation because the DoD CIO met the intent of the recommendation. The DoD CIO, in response to this audit report, stated three things. The Cyber AB oversees a C3PAO status which requires the C3PAO to report changes associated with any of the requirements in the 12-step authorization process to the AB. The CMMC PMO director plans to modify the AB contract to direct the AB to revise its procedures to ensure that C3PAOs notify the AB of any changes associated with the 12 requirements for authorization, reauthorization, or accreditation in a timely manner. And finally, the PMO plans to add new contract deliverables that will require the DoD to be notified of when C3PAOs notify the AB. And that's the process. So not only do they have the process, not only did they have the process, they're going to beef up the existing process, but the IG gets to say, well, we had a finding, and so we're making a recommendation for a thing that already existed. And because it already existed and it met the intent of the recommendation is resolved. But it doesn't say that on the summary page. You got to dig all the way to the back of the report to find that part. So there were three recommendations for the DoD CIO, CMMC PMO. One is unresolved, this overall quality assurance process the IG thinks that they should need, which honestly, the entities in this report brought upon themselves because they didn't have their I's dotted and their T's crossed, even if they had I's and T's on the page. The recommendation to develop reauthorization is resolved, and the recommendation to have reporting regarding changes for this 12-step process is resolved. So it's 3 of the 10 recommendations that the IG had in the overall report. So what do you think? Is this really the disaster, crisis, out of control dumpster fire that the headlines and the hot takes on LinkedIn would have you believe? Maybe that is buried in the other findings for the AB or for DIBCAC that we're going to talk about in future episodes. I'm not going to add my opinion. We're going to save that for the end. What do you think in chat, in the comments? Do you think that this is a huge problem? Let us know, and then we'll go from there.
If you start reading IG reports from the back to the front, I'm going to think that there's a problem. We're going to have to talk to somebody.
That's how I recommend people read NIST publications, is from the back to the front and from the bottom up, because all the interesting information is at the bottom of each page, at the back of each chapter, at the end of each sentence, in the footnotes, because it's all written in a very passive governmental way. And if you dump it into ChatGPT, it doesn't fix it for you. You got to actually have somebody read it. You got to have somebody read it. If you don't think that this is a massive problem, and you don't think that this is some sort of vendetta or death knell against CMMC, and you want to get started, check out our website. We got a bunch of free resources on there. We do this podcast every week. We do a live Q&A every Friday. We got a Pathfinder tool that'll help you get started. We got CS2 Reston coming up. We got a bunch of Summit 7 live events coming up. We got a bunch of webinars coming up. We put out a ton of free information for everybody to figure out what's going on. Follow us on LinkedIn, like and subscribe on YouTube, and then we'll look at the next recommendations next week.
See you next week, folks.
See ya.